Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session of Podchaser Pro's webinar series. We'll get things kicked off here in just a minute. In the meantime, I will make sure that we've got all of our AV ready to roll. Cool. Um, let's see. Anyone in the chat, can you just hand up? You can see my screen. Yep. Thanks, John. Danny. Yes. All right. Cool. Awesome. So today we are going to review and analyze some of the data that we have from our 2026 State of Podcast Guest Pitching Report. Let me enter full screen so we can all see it. And this is usually one of our most signed up for webinars that we've had to date. And I think it's because a lot of people are feeling and seeing some of the impact of more people entering into the podcast guest pitching space, the rise of AI and guest pitching. And you've heard us talk about on these webinars so many times, different strategies to use, different ways to find new shows, different pitch formats to help get through some of this clutter or junk that we see in the space currently. And we've had a lot of great guests over the past few months, especially Brittany Martin, Leverage with Media, Spencer Carpenter, Outlier Audio, talking about different ways that they approach the podcast space. So instead of just relying on podcast pitchers to tell this story, we actually flipped the script and we surveyed about 24 or 25 total podcast uh, production agencies, podcast hosts, podcast producers, and collectively they manage over 100 podcasts, 108 to be specific. And we asked them pretty simple questions, which we'll get to here in a minute. But just to not bury the lead, there's significant disconnect right now when it comes to the role of the pitcher versus the role of the person who's responsible for actually creating a podcast. And again, there's going to be a lot of reasons for this. We've unpacked many of these in previous webinars, but again, we're going to look at this through the lens of the ones who matter most, and those are the people that are going to be gatekeeping, for lack of a better term, our ability to actually secure guest opportunities for our clients or for ourselves. And obviously, the highlight here is the acceptance rate is nearing about 10%, and it's much smaller for major networks as well. So again, we'll unpack why that is, what we can do about it, and then we'll carry on from there. So getting to those four questions that we asked, we wanted to keep this pretty simple. And the first one was, what's the best guest interview pitch you ever received? The second is, what's the worst pitch you've ever received? And then third, if you were to guess, what percentage of pitches do you respond to versus say yes to? And then finally, what's the one thing you wish podcast guest pitchers knew? Now, as you could probably tell through the compilation of these questions, this is going to be equal parts quantitative as well as qualitative as far as surveys are concerned. Many surveys are going to be strictly quantitative, so they're going to be very much numbers based. There's only one question in particular that we're asking that is numbers based. However, by taking the anecdotal responses, the qualitative responses that we received, and then bucketing them or segmenting them based on overall themes, we were able to pull through some significant through lines, and that's also reflected in some of the more quantitative data that we'll present here as well. So, is this a statistically significant sample? I think over 108 podcasts. I would argue yes. I don't know how many people are reaching out to that many shows or that many folks that are associated with shows. There are going to be a couple of statistical anomalies that we'll take a look at as well. So, with all that in mind, we will dive into the report itself. If anyone has any questions or has commentary, by all means, please throw it in the chat. This is going to be a little bit more speaker heavy, so I'll be speaking quite a bit deal more, but I want to make sure that we're addressing questions as they come in too. So again, first question that we asked, what is the best guest interview pitch that you've ever received? And again, the way that we segmented these questions or the responses to said questions kind of fell into four major buckets. So the first was going to be hyper personalized. This is, if you Google best practices for podcast guest pitching, personalization is obviously always going to come up. I think the definition of personalization has probably far too many answers to it. Personalization does not necessarily mean or equate to just putting in the podcast host's name. So addressing, hey, first name or hey, podcast name. Personalization actually goes much deeper. We'll pull through some of these threads as well as we get to the next section. But what we want to do here is demonstrate that we understand what the podcast is actually trying to make their audiences feel. And I think that is probably the most useful heuristic to use when we're defining what personalization actually is. We'll get into some finer details of that here in a bit. Secondarily, and probably most importantly, I would say, is best pitches are going to be idea driven. And we about, oh gosh, 18 months ago had on Lauren Pissell. She is one of the founders of Tink Media. They do a lot of podcast guest swaps. Maybe some of you were in attendance for that. And at the time, she had mentioned this as being her number one key to success of finding podcasts that want to interview fellow podcasters. And it's a pretty simple premise, right? Instead of pitching the guest, you're actually pitching an episode idea. Well, if I'm pitching an episode idea, I need to understand what kind of episodes a podcaster is typically bringing to air, right? So, in a lot of ways, I think being idea driven or pitching the concept of an episode is a form of hyper personalization. And the only way you can really pitch an idea or an episode idea for a show is if you're intimately aware of that show. You understand what they're trying to do. You understand their flow. You understand the format of the way that they produce their content. So again, this idea-driven episode idea is one that is going to take a lot of practice for most of us to get accustomed to, but we'll discuss some ways in which we can make that a little bit easier, partly using Podchaser Pro to do that. Third, the best guest interview pitches are going to be easy to execute. And I've seen this time and time again. We'll pull up a couple examples on worst guest pitches, and maybe we can use that as a frame of reference as we revisit this concept. But you shouldn't have to make a producer work for you to say yes, for them to say yes to your guest being on their show. So some of the kind of underlying or underpinning of easy to execute includes having a bio, having a headshot, having questions that they want to be asked, having some of those episode ideas already at the arm. And instead of making a producer work for it, instead we're kind of hand delivering this curated experience for them. Now, about 6 months ago, I was on a panel with the Public Relations Society of America's DC chapter. And with that panel, there were producers from Johns Hopkins University's podcast, as well as Pew Center for Research podcast. And when they were talking about something being easy to execute, they were really discussing this. They wanted to have all of the context for the episode, for the show, what was actually being pitched, delivered in a concise format. And again, this is something easy execution, definitely still scaffolds up to that hyper personalization side of things as well. And then finally, intriguing hooks. So one producer highlighted a pitch about a guest with a secret story. And this, I would say, proceed with caution. Sometimes we let our imaginations run wild. We're trying to be too cute with the way that we pitch things. However, I think there's a really interesting way to actually accomplish this. You see this in headline writing copy sometimes, where a headline will ask a certain question and it has significant ramifications for those that are reading it. And as nature kind of makes us do this, we become curious. We explore our curiosities about that topic, which helps us keep going and keep reading and keep wanting to understand. So there are some elements of copywriting that would be involved with this. There are some interesting mysteries that we can kind of wedge into some of our pitches to make this a little bit more accessible as well. But I think this intriguing hook concept definitely goes back to the hyper personalization. And how are you going to be able to do that? Well, if you're looking at episode transcripts, you're seeing the types of questions that podcasters are asking their guests. What is the grand reveal? What is the big story? What is the big insight? Um, Being able to polish that into an intriguing hook is definitely going to make a lot of sense here. So, if we were to kind of summarize this, what producers are looking for is relevance and frictionless booking. The most successful pitchers act as creative partners who help the host envision a specific episode. Now, again, this is going to take time. This is going to take practice. This is going to take a lot of iteration in many cases. And I know, especially in the PR world, especially the PR agency world, time is a luxury, sometimes as opposed to being something that's readily available. However, when we start to get into some of the data, specifically with the pitch response rates as well as the acceptance rates, I think what will hopefully come out of this presentation thinking about is how do I stand out more? How do I take the time and energy and effort that's put into podcast placements and do so with much greater intention? And again, through some of these processes, through some of these details, we should be able to do just that. Next, authenticity is a major factor. Responses repeatedly mentioned that non-AI or human tone makes a pitch scroll stopping. And we'll get into a lot of this further down the line too, especially as we look at bad pitches. But we've been talking about AI as being one of the big reasons why podcast guest pitching has been getting harder than ever. We did two different webinars on that in 2025. A lot of that was anecdotal data. So now that we have real podcasters, real producers giving us these real insights, I think we can safely say that if you are only using AI to spray and pray and match your guest with a podcast that might vaguely talk about the same topic your guest is interested in speaking on, and you're using AI to do it, even if that pitch does get through an AI spam filter, which again we've talked about, Google and Outlook have done significant upgrades to their filtering and monitoring platforms within their email suites. Once it does actually reach a human, the human is very discerning when it comes to what has been written exactly for them versus what something has been outsourced to an LLM to actually do. And then finally, there is a clear preference for pitches that offer a unique narrative arc rather than a standard resume. And again, for those of you that are Podchaser Pro customers and you're taking advantage of our podcast target list building offering that we do have, we see this time and time again. And we ask a series of questions, about 12 questions, but one of them is a guest bio, and then some questions that we think that the client thinks that they want to be asked on podcasts. And to a T, for every 10 of these requests that come in for a list build, the bios that we receive, and sometimes nothing more than just a bio, they are the most stale, sterile corporate versions of a bio that you could possibly imagine. And if you are pitching a guest based solely on their bio, how are you going to cross that chasm to actually make it interesting for a podcast producer or a podcast host to say yes to? It's not a job interview. It might look like a CV or a resume, but that's not what we're after. What we're chasing as guest bookers, as those that are responsible for getting clients as guests on podcasts, is that human angle, that human connection, that human touch. And with that, what kind of mark do we want to leave on the audience of the podcast? So that's where this narrative arc can really come into play. And that's as reflected through kind of the idea driven or episode driven call out that we gathered from the responses. And speaking of that, there is one example by Doug Downs. Doug has been a great kind of partner and steward in creating this research report. I actually gave him an advanced version of this, and we were able to discuss it on his podcast, Stories and Strategies, on his YouTube channel. And that episode just went live yesterday. But one of the key things that Doug said was, "You want to be the blue M&M in a bowl full of red." And coming from a sales background or B2B SaaS as Podchaser is, that's something that we preach all the time. We're looking for a pattern interrupt. So in a sea of white circles, how do you stand out as a red X? I think that analogy between the red and the blue M&M certainly stands out as well. So that's some pontificating, but what do these podcasters actually say? And the aforementioned Doug Downs says, and I'm going to read this verbatim because I know it's a little bit small, but Doug says, by far the best pitches we get are about episode ideas or topics, not meet this great person and how smart they are. We think with the listener first, and they don't care about who they are, about why and what. So the best pitch that stands out to me right now was a very personal note from someone who had a bizarre idea for an episode, but it was just so obvious that they hadn't used AI to write the note, and it made me stop for a few seconds and think about it. Those few seconds turned into half a minute, and that half a minute turned into 3 minutes. Then I realized I'd been taken on the same thinking journey as any podcast listener, and I realized we had an episode idea. It was the blue M&M in the bowl of red M&Ms, parenthetically different, but that was part of its charm. So Doug manages over 20 podcasts. He produces them on behalf of big brands, small brands, service providers, so on and so forth. And it really spans the gamut as far as podcast categories are concerned. And being in that unique position where he can basically oversee inboxes across, 20 different podcasts, he's getting inundated with pitches. And for Doug to give us this really clear guidance in that we're pitching the listener first, which again, if you've appeared on any of our webinars with me previously, we always talk about listener first, audience first. Brittany Martin talked about that in our last webinar as well. And I think one of the biggest points of consternation that the pitchers have is, well, I don't know anything about the audience. And obviously, if you're not using Podchaser Pro, that's probably going to be the case. With Pro, we can understand a little bit more about who the podcast listener is, thanks to audience demographics. But there's also additional signals that exist outside of Pro, and that's going to be their social following. That's going to be who they're interacting with, who's leaving comments on their posts after they're publishing episode clips, and that sort of thing. So if we really want to unpack what this actually means, I think it really comes down to being empathetic about who the audience is and what kind of value your guest is actually going to deliver to them. So there's going to be a lot more that we can talk about on that, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Next, we will pivot to what's the worst guest pitch you've ever received. Um, Again, we've talked about this till we've been blue in the face, and this isn't a public shaming moment by any stretch of the imagination. This is actually, I think, hopefully going to change some hearts and minds about your entire strategy to podcast guest pitching, because again, the data, the insights that we're gathering from our clients here, and as well as non-clients, is going to be pretty substantial. So first and foremost, the worst pitches are going to be the spray and pray tactics. And what do we mean by that? Sending the bulk emails using or incorrectly using the mail merge tags. So if we had several respondents say how many pitches that they receive where the personalization token that's supposed to be in the first sentence, such as hi first name, literally says hi first name. These are supremely avoidable mistakes. However, in our rush to meet deadlines, to meet client expectations, sometimes this happens. And this is where we want to just dial in on the point that we have to approach this intentionally. And there's going to be a lot more reasons for that, but you're going to end up burning a lot of bridges. And we'll see that actually pull through with some of these quotes here in a second. Second, the worst guest pitch interviews are going to provide irrelevant content. So we had one podcaster in particular talk about they were pitched a menstruation expert, and their audience was about 85% male. Now, I think there's probably an interesting or an intriguing way to potentially make that viable for that audience. I'm not going to be the one to do it. I wouldn't recommend most people be the one to do it. It's going to take a different kind of approach, different kind of pitch. And again, we've seen this time and time again through these responses that so many people are pitching incorrectly, not just from like the format of the pitch itself, but there's not any sort of content alignment. There's no sort of contextual alignment between the guest's expertise and the podcast's audience. So we need to avoid that at all costs. Thirdly, the producer homework. So just telling a host you have this person on without explaining why or providing context, and it forces the producer to do a lot of the legwork on their own. And again, we've had a few different conversations. We get a lot of questions in the Q&A portions of these webinars about, well, should I be sending a one sheet? Should I be linking it? Should I be attaching it? I think Any one of those things could be true. However, what we learned from Brittany in our last webinar that we did is the amount of research that she puts into podcast guest pitching, and the very little of it actually lives within the pitch itself. It actually goes back to the five, six, seven, eight steps that happen before you ever send a pitch. So yes, you're going to get some of these insights out of Podchaser Pro, but you also need to very deeply go into who the host is, who the producer is, what they care about, and then build a package around that. There's going to be some easier ways to do that, but a lot of it's just going to come down to pure time and attention and intentionally seeking out these nuggets of wisdom, and then packaging that all up in a consumable way. So again, Podchaser is going to tell us one thing and we're going to verify that, we're going to trust it, but we also need to go to, for example, the host's Instagram profile and see, well, if they're not talking about their podcast content, what else are they talking about? And then start to understand, hey, this person seems to be mobily native. Great. Well, if it's a mobile native person, sending them a link to a Google Drive file that they have to download Google Drive on their phone to be able to read it and actually see your client's one-sheeter, that's not going to be optimal, right? So again, these are going to be some of the nuances here that are going to take a little bit more time. And then finally, blatant AI pitches are the worst that are going to land in podcasters and producers' inboxes. And getting to this, I think AI, obviously, we can do so many different things with. It's an incredible research partner. It's an incredible image generator in a lot of different ways now. However, it is not going to be able to understand who the host audience is and tie that directly back to your client's areas of interest or expertise. And that's why, in their own words, many of the respondents to our survey said that the worst pitches are a waste of time, first and foremost, but also a sign of disrespect towards the host's craft. And this is a point that I don't want to spend too much time on, but I do want to drive home the point that a lot of podcasters are not doing this for the fame and the fortune and all of the accolades. They're doing this because they've got a natural curiosity. They're taking time out of their day. Sometimes they'll already have a 9 to 5, and their podcast is what they're working on from 5 to 9. And for us to just blatantly railroad them with irrelevant pitches, AI written pitches, having zero concern for who their audience is and what value your guests can actually provide to them, it is viewed as a form of disrespect. And there's another quote within this, which we'll get to in a second. But for many podcasts and many podcast listeners, the thing that they're listening to is actually a sacred space. That was a direct quote from one of our respondents. And what do we mean by sacred space? Well, when you think about podcast consumption, obviously it's a very intentional medium. It's not being served to you, you have to seek it out. So you're not just going to be sitting on YouTube necessarily, and then you're listening to a music video as you're hammering away at your keyboard, and then a new video pops up, and that's just fed to you algorithmically. If you want to listen to a podcast, you have to go into an Apple or Spotify app or any of the other ones. You have to find the show that you want to listen to. You actually have to click play on it, and then you're immersed in that world. So it becomes part of a ritual or routine or a habit, especially when we look at how people are consuming podcasts, whether it's on their daily commute, on the train, on their drive into work, what have you, if they're at the gym. It is this sacred place. And because many podcasts are going to do 3 episodes a week, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for an hour, these people are tuned in. It feels like they're sitting across from a friend, someone that they know. And we've talked about this in previous webinars about the parasocial relationship that exists between podcast hosts and their audiences. We've seen major podcasters like Scott Galloway talk about the craziest interactions that he has on the street when he's just walking around New York, going to dinner, what have you, is when somebody comes up to him, extremely cheery, extremely jolly, and approaches him like he's their friend. Scott Galloway has no idea who this person is, and within a split second, he knows, well, this person listens to my podcasts, right? So again, this is a sacred space. This is a craft, if you will. In a lot of ways, creators, whether podcasters view themselves as creators or not, this is really a mark of their creative output and part of their kind of overall essence or being. Producers also have a high sensitivity to being sold to via automation. And when you think about it, I think it probably stands true, especially if you've been on the receiving end of a pitch for anything via email. Oftentimes it feels like I'm a nail and there are a bunch of hammers that are coming after me. The amount of free AI SEO audits that I get in my inbox on a daily basis today, as being our head of growth at Podchaser, I think I have six or seven, all offering the same thing. They're all noise. They might be really good. I'll have no idea because I've kind of tuned out that entire offer because again, I'm receiving these types of pitches from sellers on a daily basis. What makes us think that that's that much different than a podcast host or podcast producer? In my opinion, it's not at all. So when a booker does fail to do the bare minimum, especially things as simple as checking if the show's still airing or often has guests versus not, it leads to immediate deletion. And in some cases, our respondents said that they actually blacklist certain podcast guest pitchers. Having had a couple conversations with people that responded in that way, and don't view this as they've got a big wall and they write your name on it and it's crossed out with a red permanent marker forever. They just very quickly see when John Smith at XYZ agency sends them an email, it just gets moved to auto delete. Adrian McIntyre, another former webinar guest of ours, has talked about this. He's got a filter that exists within his email inbox that automatically routes things to pitches. And he sees the same people show up in that folder over and over and over again. So, again, this all goes back to the point of intentionality. And if we aren't doing the bare minimum, and clearly based on this, the bare minimum is going to be just spending a couple of days listening to podcasts, doing research on the host, doing research on the producers outside of just what we see in Podchaser Pro, but also on social as well. So we want to avoid immediate deletion. We want to avoid being blacklisted at all costs. Now, there is another producer that we talked to that does have a little bit more aggressive means of blacklisting. And when they do that, they actually block the domain of the email sender. So now anybody who's coming from that email domain, this might not be as relevant for boutique agencies that we work with, but if you're at a larger agency and your compatriots have been sending irrelevant guest pitches to podcasts over and over and over again, you could do the disservice to your entire agency where your entire email domain is blocked from landing in the inbox of a podcaster. So again, please proceed with caution. There are both human and non-human ways that this is leading to disastrous impact. But let's see what some of the podcasters actually had to say themselves. So this is Jay Yao. Jay is a producer at the James Altucher Show. James has a very long-standing podcast, has been on charts multiple times. And what Jay says, I have someone randomly text me and say you should have so and so on the show. I would then ask, who are they and why should they be on the show? Do you have a one sheet? Those I usually immediately say no to. If your pitch email has any of the below, it's an immediate no. Podcast magician, podcast expert, first name, last name. And also, when you pretend like you know the show and attempt to give an example why you like the show. And I want to touch on that a bit because there have been times where we've offered that as guidance as Podchaser. Maybe your client success manager, maybe me on a webinar. And I think this is a little bit different, and I want to unpack some of the nuance behind it. So, pretending like you know the show versus actually knowing the show are two very different things. Now, the only way you can kind of cross that bridge or cross that chasm that exists between the two things is by having that intimate understanding of who the show is. And again, Podchaser is going to give you a lot of information about that. However, if you don't take it to that next level or that next step and research the host on socials, research the producer on socials, just saying, hey, I listened to episode 67 and what you said about macroeconomic theory really stuck out with me, and then you immediately launch into a pitch, that is not going to pass the sniff test, if you will, as Jay kind of describes it here, of actually knowing the show. It shows that you know how to maybe go to a transcript, find a keyword in and around what your client does, and then just kind of blindly paste that into a pitch, that's not going to get you the results that you want and or need. By actually understanding the show, it is going to come off in a much more authentic way. And I think that's one of the big issues that we see with AI. And it's going to feign understanding of these issues or topics or nuances. However, it doesn't actually get to the core of it. So, for example, many podcasts will have terms of endearment or designation for their listeners. There's a show on Barstool called Pardon My Take. They refer to their audience as AWLs, award-winning listeners. If you were to pitch them and just talk about maybe you had a client that you wanted to get out on doing a media tour, they've got a new initiative, new book, new nonprofit organization, whatever it is. If you were to pitch, pardon my take, and only talk about the guest and not reference the AWLs, the award-winning listeners, it would stand out like a sore thumb. If you actually understand kind of what that tribal mindset is of the audience and of the host relation to that audience, it's going to go much further. It doesn't guarantee you're going to land a placement. However, it's going to show that you actually know these types of things. Giggly Squad, another one. That's Hannah Berner, Paige DeSorbo, an ACAST show, by the way. Call out there. They describe their audience as gigglers. So instead of just saying, hey, we've got this personal finance a female personal finance lead. She's doing great work and helping women aged 25 to 34 understand their compensation at work, make smart investments, and it's really going to help level up the gigglers' financial independence and freedom. That would go a lot further than just saying, "Hey, your audience would definitely benefit from having a female financial planning and success guest on the show," right? So again, these are going to end up being table stakes, and no AI tool is going to be able to pull these insights forward for you. The next, and this isn't a design snafu. This is an actual pitch that Rob Conlon, he's the president at Westport Studios. He does a lot of B2B podcast production, 2 dozen clients thereabouts. This is an actual verbatim pitch that he received. I redacted the name. And what you can see, not only is it very poorly formatted, it's just, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. So if something like this landed in your inbox, would you respond to it? Probably not. So again, I'm not going to read this verbatim because I think you get the picture, but some of the pitches that we receive, especially through some of the client feedback that we get, because if you do have a client success manager and you want to throw a pitch their way and have them review it, many of you take up Jules on that offer, John, Sydney, etc. Please do that, because if it looks anything like this, what they're going to immediately say is, how do we cut this down? How do we cut this in half? And then how do we cut this in half again? So again, if you're sending pitches that look like this, please stop. Lovingly. All right, so now getting to the real meat and potatoes of this, and this is going to be the data. So this is the what percentage of pitches do you respond to versus say yes to. So we're going to look at the 2 different metrics being the response rate and yes rate, and then we're going to look at the ranges of respondents as well as the median and the average based off of these metrics. So the range from responses was 1% to 90%. So I mentioned a statistical anomaly at the beginning of this. That anomaly is we had one respondent say that they respond to 90% of guest pitches that they receive. I don't know if that's an accurate number, might be in the ballpark of what they actually do. However, when we look at that, it is going to pull averages a lot higher, which is why I thought it was going to be important to include the median number in that. So with a response rate of 1% to 90%, a median response rate being 17.5%, and an average response rate being about 28%, you start to understand that at most, 1 out of 3, a little bit less than that, closer to 1 out of 4, are even going to get responses. So I would take this number back and take a look at your pitching success or lack thereof and say, okay, of all the pitches that my team has sent out this week, this month, this day, how many responses did we actually get? Whether that's a no, not right now, not interested, etc. Document all of that and then use this as a benchmark to go against. Now, the yes rate, again, because we had that same individual that responded to 90%, they also say yes to about 40%. So the show is on the smaller side. It is an independent show. So take that for what it's worth. Power score range was last time I checked, it was about 20 to 30 power score. So if you're familiar with Podchaser's proprietary metric of power score, it's going to be on the lower side. Doesn't mean it's less valuable by any stretch of the imagination. However, I just want to provide some context from the data side. So less than 1% to 40% being the range. The median range is going, or the median yes rate is going to be 5%, and the average rate is going to be about 10.6%. Now, as we've publicized this event, as we've started to publicize different parts of this data story, we've also received quite a few comments from folks on LinkedIn and various other places as well. And for like dedicated podcast guest booking agencies, i.e., those that are not a larger PR firm that's also doing traditional media, that's also doing other types of earned media outreach. A lot of those respondents are saying that their yes rates are going to be between 25 and 40%. And I can tell you when we ran Podchaser Connect, which was the guest booking agency that sat on top of the Podchaser Pro platform, that was the division that I ran for a couple of years before it was acquired by a different agency. Our yes rate was between 22.5% to 28%, depending on the individual who's actually responsible for booking. So that should probably be the table stakes. That said, there's a bit of a difference between a dedicated podcast guest booking agency and these agencies that are doing a lot of other things as well. So my advice on this is, and we've seen this work really well, even with some of the largest agencies in the world that we're lucky and happy to have as Podchaser Pro clients. The best ones, the ones that get the most success in guest pitching and kind of harnessing the power of podcasts, they have somebody that's dedicated to being the podcast person. And it could be a Madison Avenue agency that's got 10,000 employees globally. But if they've got one person that kind of owns the podcast space, they act as a conduit for everybody else within the organization. So if a junior level account coordinator comes to them with a question about podcasts, they are the person that can answer. As we publish new data, new stories, new ideas, new strategies, they are the ones that disseminate that to the rest of the organization. I highly recommend that. And if you are one of those people, the podcast champion within your agency, um, let's do more together to equip you and your team with these insights and the data that matters most. And again, one of these data points is going to be the acceptance rate. So again, coming out of today's presentation, I would highly advise take a look at your own metrics, whether you're using a mass sending tool or one-to-one emails directly out of your Gmail or your Outlook. Try to do a quick audit on yourself and on your team and understand how close am I to these benchmarks? What can I do to improve them? Am I using spray and pray? If I stopped doing that and gave a little bit more time to this intentional outreach, as I'm calling it, what kind of metrics would we see after that? And then you can test it. So with some of these suggestions that we'll have and some of these ideas that we'll have, I would treat it like an experiment, and almost like if you're familiar with how pharmacology works and how drugs and prescription medication move through phases. You know, make a change in the phase one trial of your podcast guest pitching. Maybe it's more hyper personalization. Maybe it's reaching out to shows that you don't have a guest for necessarily, but you want to build a relationship with. So when you do have a guest, it's going to be a fit for their show. You've already nurtured, you've already built that relationship. You already have an understanding of who they are and what they're looking for. Once that is accomplished, move on to phase two. Phase two would be, okay, well, once we've got that variable figured out, do we need to change any other variables if we haven't seen a positive increase in the amount of yeses that we receive or even responses that we receive? And once you have that dialed in, now move on to phase three and so on and so forth. So I think really treating this as kind of a phased approach is going to be how you're going to experience better wins and more wins. And again, this is all going to come down to first doing an audit of your current success metrics, your team's success metrics, and then building a plan based off of that. Oh, and just quickly to kind of contextualize some of this data as well. What this really showcases to us is we're living in this high volume, low yield environment. And went back and forth and hemmed and hawed a little bit about leading off this presentation with K strategy and R strategy, which is practices and laws that exist within nature. And our strategies are going to be high reproduction. These are found in the animal kingdom, by the way. So again, if I lose you here, I'll know that it was a good decision not to lead with this. But in our selection, there's a high rate of reproduction. There's very low survival rate, and the idea is to try to populate as much as you can because of the unstable or unpredictable environment. Not everything is going to make it, and that's basically what pitching en masse is going to equate to. Well, if I send out 100 pitches and I don't personalize any of them and I don't do research on any of them, surely at least a couple of them are going to come back and say yes. It's no time wasted for me. I just sprayed and prayed. Now, in the animal kingdom, do we know what types of animals are our producers or our strategists? Those are going to be mosquitoes, those are going to be rodents, and those are going to be bugs as well as weeds. So if you think about that and you kind of parlay that into the podcast guest pitching experience, well, if I'm deploying the same tactics and strategies that mosquitoes are deploying for their survival, oh, does that make me a mosquito? And based on some of these hosts and producers' responses, yeah, it kind of does make us a mosquito. Versus a case selection strategy, which is going to take a lot longer to find the right mate. It's going to require high parental investment. So again, when these animals are born, parents are very involved very early on. These animals are typically born larger. And what do we know? What kind of animals are part of the K strategy? Those are going to be mammals, humans chiefly, but also elephants and large mammals such as that. So again, do I want to be a human in the very literal sense, or do I want to be a mosquito in the very figurative sense? And again, if you didn't pay attention in high school biology, that was me taking you back to a dusty classroom. So this is from Chris Stone. Chris is the executive producer of a number of podcasts on the New Statesman. It's actually based in the UK. The New Statesman is a newspaper and journal. I think they have a magazine as well. But Chris is a great guy. Highly recommend following him on LinkedIn. He also has a newsletter that he publishes. But Chris says, I probably respond to at most 10% of pitches, and he probably says yes to maybe 3%. Mostly, this reflects how the majority of the pitches I receive are completely irrelevant to my shows. You can tell PRs have just sent a bulk email to a random list of emails without targeting specific shows. Sadly, it makes it harder to spot the good pitches when they come in. Again, this is going to be reflective of basically every slide that we've gone through so far, but the equivalent of the New Statesman would be like a major news outlet here in the US. And if this is somebody that is heading up all audio and video for a major news organization, and he's saying, hey, listen, I'm getting a lot of pitches. I'm not even seeing a lot of the good ones because I'm just drowning in the bad ones. Hopefully that's going to help us take note. So again, referencing back to that panel that I did with Pew and with Johns Hopkins, it was the exact same kind of theme that we saw them describe the pitches that they receive. Hey, we're doing these topical types of shows. A lot of our content is already pre-produced. You might have a really interesting study for us, a really interesting guest for us, but if it's not aligned with where we're at in the topical discourse, then it's just going to fall flat. So again, this is going to be a real world example from Chris. And then finally, what's the one thing podcast guest pitchers should know? First, it's going to be listen. And this goes back to a lot of the authenticity that we talked about as well. But so many of them said actually listen to an episode or two, understand the host style, the show's goal. And I think one of the things that I saw with this is, and some of the responses was, it's very important for podcast guest pitchers to understand how the podcast wants their audience to feel. And this is going to be a difficult thing to deduce if you're only using filters within Podchaser Pro and not deep diving into the shows themselves and actually listening to them, understanding the types of questions the host is asking, understanding the type of language the host is using. But you can do that if you approach this with time and attention. Pitch the value, so explain why the audience will want to click play, not just why the guest is smart. Again, if there's one element of the pitch side of things, I think that is going to be it. Like, what is the value to the audience? We've talked about different strategies for conveying this, especially using the 4 A's framework, which we'll talk again about in a little bit. But actionable, aspirational, anthropological, or analytical. So many shows are going to have one or multiple of those angles or frames. Which one does your guest most closely align with? How do we marry those two things together and actually show in the pitch itself that we understand what you're trying to do? So if it's an analytical shows are going to be speaking a lot more about numbers, about data, about research, etc. Well, getting somebody who has an incredible founder's journey to come on and talk about it, it's going to be a lot more difficult if we're not also including data and research and stories. If it's an aspirational podcast, so inspiring others to do the great things, maybe that is going to be a better fit for this founder's journey story that your client wants to tell, as opposed to a more numbers based thing. If it's a anthropological, well, we have to come at it from a very different angle. We have to unpack some of the reasons behind the reasons, the second and third order effects, because that's what the show is doing. So how do we put our clients in a position where they're going to be able to tell that story and their second and third order effects that they've experienced as well. So again, what we're really looking for is alignment on this side. Keep it brief. So many podcasters actually said that they prefer having a pitch be 150 words or less. I think that's going to be a little bit difficult for most of us. However, if you have done some of your diligence outside of just Podchaser Pro and you've actually explored who they are, what makes them tick, etc., on social media, on other articles that they've written, maybe subscribing to their newsletter, you'll start to get a lot better feel for it. So if you've got this massive biography or like that pitch that Rob sent us, there might be one or two really key points out of that that would actually resonate most with Rob's audience or Rob's client's audience. But we need to condense it. We need to get it down to that kind of minimal viable and really deliver that. And it's almost impossible to do that unless you actually understand the podcast, you actually listen to it. And then finally, stop the homework. So don't make the producer research your guests, give them the why and the how immediately. So again, what we're looking to do is build authenticity, build trust within this space. And I understand there are 6 million podcasts, about 460,000 of them are currently active. About half of that are accepting guests, maybe a little bit more based on our latest data. It's going to be difficult to know everything about hundreds of thousands of podcasts versus traditional media where you've got, 4 major broadcast networks and you've got the cable networks and there's just a lot less for you to have to kind of siphon through as far as signal to noise ratios. However, take a look at the total addressable market for your podcast. So if you're working with somebody that's doing CRM consulting, well, there's not going to be hundreds of thousands of podcasts that are talking about CRM consulting and implementation and optimization. There's probably going to be dozens, hundreds. You have the time, you have the energy, you have the ability with tools like Podchaser Pro and social stalking, for lack of a better term, where you can understand that podcast inside and out. And I would highly suggest that. That will be a suggestion that we'll put here towards the end of the webinar. But instead of trying to boil the ocean and not get intimate about who these podcasters are and what their shows are about, reduce it down to the bare minimum. Like, what are the top 10 shows that are going to be talking about this topic? What are the top 20? What are the top 50? And really start to build out what I've discussed in previous webinars of tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 strategies. So tier 1 strategies, again, these are going to be highly hands-on. You're going to get to know them. You're going to subscribe to their newsletter, subscribe to their YouTube channel, listen to their podcasts, and then obviously engage with them as well so they understand who you are and what you do. Brittany Martin's brilliant suggestion of having a professional Instagram that is separate from her personal Instagram, where she is doing exactly that. She's going to the podcasters' Instagram pages, she's engaging with their content, she's leaving meaningful comments, she's supporting them. Again, if we're going back to the podcaster as an artisan or as a creator, support them, show them that you actually care and you're not just looking for distribution for your clients, but you're actually caring about their craft and what they do. It's going to take you a lot further along the way. So again, this is going to be a key point. So again, the core disconnect is that bookers often view podcasts as the distribution channel for their clients, while producers view their shows as a sacred space for their audience. And again, we talked about that sacred space phrase previously, but it really is true. The analysis suggests that bookers who transition from a sales mindset to an editorial mindset, pitching the specific tailored value for the listener, will see success rates improve over time. And this is 100% true based on my own lived experience in pitching podcasts in our team when we did about 80 placements per month for our guests. And this will come from Max. Max is the founder of Max Podcasting, and he, again, produces dozens of shows for his clients. Who said most podcast hosts love the creative freedom they have with their podcasts, and a big part of that is the ability to interview whoever they want, whenever they want. As a podcast booker, you need to understand the type of guest that would be an ideal fit for each podcast. That means asking the podcast who their ideal guests are and actually listening / watching an episode or two to understand and feel of the show and the style of the host. Doing these two things saves a ton of wasted time for the booker, host, and potential guest. So I think Max brings up a really good point. We talk about how to find best fit shows, whether that's using our content, context, audience, and reach framework. However, hosts also have an archetype. Producers also have an archetype of the types of guests that they're actually looking for. And this is something, just to tease a little thing that we're working on in the background. And I think I've mentioned this on previous webinars, but building a guest scorecard that's taking a look at quantitative and qualitative analysis of the 10 most recent guests on a podcast. We're working on an interesting program with the benefit of AI or the help of AI. And it's actually going to do that. So, for example, we looked at My First Million, which is a HubSpot podcast. It's hosted by Sam Parr and Sean Puri. Through that, we were able to we looked at the last 60 episodes that they had that featured guests, and we scored out quantitatively and qualitatively who these guests were and what their stories were. So, as part of that, there were effectively 7 different criteria that a guest had to satisfy in order to be a fit for a guest or be a fit as a guest on that show. And these ranged from having data to back up their claims, having a certain level of success. So had they raised a Series A or a Series B fund, had they scaled past $10 million, had they had a successful exit in the business, so on and so forth. So again, this is going to take a lot more time and attention, as I've already asked you to do currently, but we are working on a solution from a product perspective that should make this a lot easier in due time as well. And as a result, even if you feel like a show is a great fit for a guest, but you look at the types of archetypes of guests that they've had on previously, if your client's not a fit, well, do I have to reconfigure my pitch, reconfigure my guest's bio to make that all of those requirements satisfied? Or is this just never going to happen? So again, if we're using the case of My First Million, maybe you're representing a client that has a direct-to-consumer branding agency. Well, if they haven't had a successful exit, if they haven't scaled past $10 million, if they don't have a unique POV, if they don't have like the secret sauce, they might never actually be a fit for My First Million. So as much as that client might want to be on My First Million, until they reach some of these thresholds, it's just not going to happen. So it's going to save you time and energy. So as opposed to sending out, again, more uh, not personalized, not tailored pitches, hopefully this is going to save you some time on the front end as well. So again, a little bit more data. This is going to be that where quantitative and qualitative survey results mix. But 63% of best pitches prioritized a specific episode idea or unique topic, and that was again the blue M&M analogy that Doug gave us. And 68% of respondents said the worst pitches were automated message and or AI generated templates. So again, I know that AI podcast guest pitching tools exist out there. We see all of their unique selling propositions saying, hey, with our tool, you can pitch 1,000 podcasts a week. Why are we pitching 1,000 podcasts a week? That's not the goal of this endeavor whatsoever. And again, it's easy for me to say that working at a competitive product or competitive platform. However, now that we've got data confirmed by actual podcast hosts and producers, the majority of them do not want to be pitched by AI. They want you to show them that you know them and they want it to be human oriented. And then coming off of that, 52% of respondents said the worst pitches completely lacked research, such as uh, naming the wrong podcast, pitching inactive shows, or pitching totally irrelevant podcasts, which goes back to, or totally irrelevant topics, which goes back to that one example that we received of the menstruation expert pitching to a largely male-dominated audience. So, what's next? A couple key things to take a look at. One, pivot to episode pitching. Again, this is going to take a lot of time. We'll probably do a separate workshop about this in the very near future because this is going to be a more dense topic that we can't cover in just today. Auditing for AI tone, and I think this goes beyond just trying to remove M dashes or some of the weird things that AI does in terms of stylized writing, but you really need to use like that human element. Deploying the use to episode minimum. Again, there's going to be some heuristics we can use to jump through this. I do think you should probably listen to at least 2 episodes. When we were running Podchaser Connect, that was kind of a table stakes for us. We did want to actually listen to episodes so we could pull this out. Again, there's going to be a lot more we can do with looking at transcripts now too. And then finally, eliminating friction from this process with the guest bios, the headshots, the assets, so on and so forth. But in practical terms, what does this all kind of boil down to? First and foremost, when it comes to show selection, content, context, audience, and reach. So content, what is the show talking about? What is my guest talking about? Context, what kind of perspectives does the host have on said topic? Does that align with the POV or perspective that my guest has? Audience, is this audience for this podcast representative of who my client wants to reach? Again, Podchaser Pro is going to be able to do a lot of that for us. And then finally, reach. Is this going to be a mass media type of show that goes, very shallow on topics, versus a very niche show that might not have more than 1,000 monthly listeners, but they go incredibly deep on the topics that they do cover. There's no right or wrong answer to that, but using content, context, audience, and reach is going to force us to be more intentional about which types of shows we're reaching out to and not just going through Apple Charts top 100 for a given subcategory, pulling all their emails out and sending the same pitch to all of them. So again, it's a forced function of the intentionality. Using the 4A frameworks, again, I touched on this a little bit, but um, what this is kind of goes to context as part of content, context, audience, and reach. But 4A's is really going to help us understand, is the show approaching their content from an analytical, anthropological, aspirational angle? And then again, what angle is my client comfortable approaching that topic from as well? We've got I think two or three different separate webinar recordings that are all about 4A's and all about content, context, audience, and reach. So we'll make sure that those are distributed once this goes live early next week as well, so you can brush up on that. Mining episode transcripts for insights is also going to be huge. So currently, Podchaser has the top 24,000 podcasts with episode transcripts. That number is going to be expanding significantly by the end of Q1 here. So a little tease for all of you. But when you are able to actually access the transcripts, even searching for your client's keywords that are relevant to your client within those transcripts, or even searching exclamation points or question marks, it's going to give us the ability to kind of hop through and time skip, if you will, to understand what was covered in regards to that topic, what kind of questions were asked in regard to that topic or keyword. And it's going to help us pull out some of these insights and pull out some of those lenses from the 4A's perspective or context from CCAR. And that's going to help facilitate a more personalized approach, a better approach, as opposed to that spray and pray. Experimenting with multi-channel outreach, I think, is going to be a huge one. Again, we have contacts on every podcast that's ever been published. However, given some of the constraints that we see as a result of AI, as a result of just the signal to noise ratio that exists within email inboxes, using the strategy that Brittany at Leverage with Media deploys and pitching on Instagram and LinkedIn, add that to your mix. Again, it's going to take a little bit more time potentially, but if we're looking at a K-shaped strategy as opposed to an R strategy for success, doing a little bit more and actually understanding who these podcasters are is going to help a lot. I think number five, we do have a few clients coming to us and requesting these types of lists, which I think is such a good use of time. Building a top 25 list that's going to be focused on building those relationships. So we've got a client that they work in the cybersecurity space, but specifically cybersecurity for fintech. So they want to know what are the top 20 podcasts that are talking about cybersecurity in a fintech context. They ask us to produce that list. We produce it for them. They're keeping tabs on them. They're seeing who's rising, who's falling, how many times they've been pitched for the various clients that they represent. And it's gonna feel a lot more like media relations from the olden days, not olden days, but the very recent olden days, where again might not be having the martini lunches and getting to know them and trying to wine and dine them, but we do want to build those relationships. So even if we don't have a client that we're actively pitching right now, we know that when they do see our email come in or our pitch come in, they understand that there's been intentionality that's been baked into it and that relationship's been built. And then finally, researching previous guests and their approach to episodes. Again, this is kind of that My First Million example I gave before, but if you can see that the last 20 guests on a podcast were all university professors and you're out pitching a spiritual healer, well, is my client, the spiritual healer, going to be in that same kind of category or be in that same level of quality as some of their previous guests? And if that answer is no, that's okay. Just move on to the next one and find one that's going to be a better fit based on the types of guests that they've had on previously. So, again, and if you're thinking to yourself, well, doesn't that kind of fly in the face about pitching an episode idea first as opposed to pitching the guest? Yes and no. Yes, in that it's kind of the inverse of what I said, but what that actually means is the podcast host is trying to convey to their audience, if they're having university researchers on as guests on the podcast, that they are bringing an extreme level of quality of expertise to the table, and it's not going to be something that anybody off the street can come in and talk about because they're effectively serving as that trust proxy for their audience. So they're only bringing on verified people that are doing real research. So in any case, went a couple minutes over, but I will open it up if anybody has any Q&As. This deck will be available. The webinar recording will be available early next week. But hopefully you learned something and saw straight out of podcasters' mouths what they're looking for and why the spray and pray approach is not going to survive that much longer. Cool. No questions? All right. Well, everyone have a wonderful weekend. Again, this will be distributed early next week. If you are a Podchaser Pro customer and you want to get in touch with your client success manager, whether it's John or Jules or Sydney, please reach out to them directly. If you have any questions about the data or any of the strategies that we talked about here, you can reach out to me directly as well. Otherwise, have a great weekend.